So my first question to you is, what are materials? And the quick answer is the things, the items, the objects that you use in intervention. Here are a couple of examples. When we're talking about perhaps using a memory book with an adult who has had a cerebrovascular accident and now has aphasia, when we're thinking about a cutting and pasting activity or maybe a glue and glitter activity. The next question is, what are activities? And those are the experiences. Here are two examples. So in the previous slide, you saw glitter and glue, and here you have children making an art project. You also had in the previous slide a memory book, and here you have an adult group in a hula class, which, by the way, hula dancing is on my bucket list, just as an aside. Now, you may use the things during the experiences. In other words, you may use the materials in your activities. And that's okay, that's to be expected. But I just wanted to make the differentiation clear. You don't necessarily need materials for activities. Well, I guess you do, but you don't always have to be obsessed over the things, which when I was a young clinician, I did all the time. I needed to make sure I had all of my things before I could actually do my activities. It's not always the case. So I have a focus question here for you. I want you to take some time to think. My second focus question to you is, moving forward in planning your sessions, what will you consider when you choose your materials or activities? What I'm asking you to do right now is to think about rationales. Up until now, we've talked about rationales on goals and procedures. And now I'm asking you about a rationale for materials and activities. I'm going to help you by giving you general categories. When you consider using materials or activities, what developmental or chronological considerations will come into play? You may have an 18-year-old with ASD who's minimally verbal and maybe has a cognitive level of 18 months of age. You can't give that client a ring stacking toy. It's just not appropriate. Remember, we talked about a functional rationale and goal development. Is the activity functional for your client's life? Will it help him or her habilitate or rehabilitate and get a skill back, or get a skill, develop a skill that he or she or they desire? Is it culturally responsive? Is this activity sensitive to one's spiritual practices or ethnic customs? So, for example, there are some religions that do not eat red meat. If you're doing a cooking activity, you want to be sure to know that information, because you don't want to plan an activity using red meat that client cannot participate in. And it may be very disruptive. It may be very upsetting to the client. So you always want to be culturally responsive. You also want to consider safety and sterility, especially now more than ever. You want to be sure that your items are easy to clean, can be cleaned between clients, that you have your cleaning materials at the ready. You also want to think about safety. You want to think about food allergies, latex allergies. You may be well-intended and bring a balloon into a session for a child, not considering that they may have a food a latex allergy, or using rubber gloves, which, depending on the age group, research does either refutes or supports use of rubber gloves. So you always have to consult the research, and you also have to think safety and sterility. You have to consider the fun factor. I always tell students or CFYs that I'm supervising, if you're not having fun, your client's not having fun. So is your activity going to be fun for the client, for yourself? Of course, the session is not about you, but you can use yourself as a gauge. You also have to think about if a session is too much fun, right? So if a child is having too much fun, he or she may not even be focused on using language because all of the cognitive resources are being recruited in the actual activity. So consider the fun factor. You want to consider group size. Are your materials plentiful and appropriate for a group? And the same for an activity. Will they work in an individual session? And that also ties back to the goal. So everything starts becoming intertwined and synergistic at this point. You also want to think about modality. Are you in person? Are you using telepractice? Can these materials activities be adapted in both modalities? So now we're going to move on to an activity. So Enemy Pie is one of my personal faves. I have the link to YouTube here for you. I'm also going to add it to Moodle. It's a 12-minute session. It's a read aloud where you get to see the pictures and hear the story being read. It is not a speech and language intervention, but what I want you to think about is, while this read aloud is going on, what goals can we as speech language pathologists address? And which activities can we create related to that book that include the entire child? Remember, think about how we know that children learn best. Will these materials and activities work online? And what else can you consider that isn't explicitly being asked here? We are going to regroup on this, so please take a few moments to take some notes down while you're watching the YouTube video. So we talked about materials, we talked about activities, and now I want to be a little bit more explicit about reinforcers. We've used this word many times in class. I'm sure you've used this word many times in other classes. I know that you have learned about this in Psych 101, but I just want to take a few moments to be explicit about this and talk about how it ties into our sessions. So there are two types of consequences. I want you to notice the quotations. In our society, we tend to think of consequences more related to punishment. The same with accountability, by the way, as an aside. But every action has a consequence, and that consequence is really a reinforcer. And there are positive consequences and negative consequences, or positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. We're going to talk a little bit about that now. So there are different types of positive reinforcers. Now, when we talk about positive reinforcers, we're talking about something that is applied or given to someone based on an action. Okay? So the first type is primary, or another word for that is unconditioned. Food is the pinnacle example of a primary reinforcer. The second type of reinforcer is called secondary, also known as conditioned. And the reason why it's called conditioned is because the person, child, adult, individual, learns that these reinforcers are actually exciting and desirable. Activities, eye contacts, tickles, social praise, informative feedback. If you're a person who loves to receive feedback, then this is perfect for you, right? Then there are negative reinforcers. Now, negative reinforcers mean that some sort of stimulus is removed, and that removal is pleasurable. So I want you to think about if you've ever been in a car and left the door open and then it started beeping incessantly. What do? You close the door. Why do you close the door? Because you want that beeping to stop. Okay, that's an example of an escape-based negative reinforcer. You are trying to escape the aversive stimulus, which is the beeping, and so you close the door. Another example is avoidance of a situation at all. So let's say that beeping of the door is so aversive to you that you just choose not to go in cars anymore. I know that sounds like an extreme example, but that is an example of avoidance. When something is so, again, aversive, upsetting, undesirable, that you avoid a situation completely. But I want to be clear that I don't want negative reinforcement to be confused with punishment, because punishment actually weakens a behavior because some sort of negative condition is introduced based on a consequence of that behavior. So when we think of the classic cases of punishment in children, we think about corporal punishment, spanking, timeouts, right? Those are reactive and they are applied specifically to reduce a behavior. Now, positive reinforcement is applied to increase the likelihood that a behavior will occur again. And by the way, negative reinforcement as well. So positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement are principles that will increase the likelihood of a behavior reoccurring. Punishment is the opposite of that. Some sort of stimulus is applied to reduce the occurrence of a behavior. We all have reinforcers. I've listed 2 of my favorites here. Okay, so thinking about a vacation, dark chocolate is my favorite. Some are reinforcing without being conditioned or learned. Okay, and that's called unconditioned, primary, or unlearned reinforcers. And there's also a very common secondary reinforcer that adults enjoy, and that's your paycheck, right? So whenever people say, I don't benefit from behavior management, it's very unlikely that that's completely true. But some reinforcers are not originally reinforcing and then become reinforcing. And that happens through pairing or association with other reinforcers, right? So that's called secondary, conditioned, or learned reinforcers. I want to give you a perfect example here, and this is personal again in my life. So I have my little vacation picture here, and this is a love-hate example. So I'm not a lover of the beach, believe it or not. I do love a vacation, but I don't love the beach itself. I think it's sensory. I don't really like the sand. I don't like suntan lotion on my skin paired with sand sticking to it. I don't know, being in direct sunlight for extended periods of time is not something I enjoy. So anyway, just hold on to that thought. Well, my son, who is an only child, loves the beach. Loves the beach. And despite how much I hate the beach, my son's love for the beach and my love for his joy made me overcome my own dislike for the beach. And therefore, I would take him to the beach 3 times a week. And we talk about now in our retirement considering buying a beach home. How's that for a 360-degree turnaround, or 180-degree turnaround? So again, primary and secondary reinforcers. A primary reinforcer, both are reinforcing, right? A primary is automatically reinforcing. Here are some examples. A secondary reinforcer is some kind of stimulus or situation that has become desirable or reinforcing after being associated with a primary reinforcer. Okay, or some sort of earlier conditioned reinforcer. Praise, grades, money, those are examples. And then one final example, I have some pictures here. When we talk about functions of behavior and types of reinforcers, attention is one type of reinforcer. Escape is another type of reinforcer. I have this picture here because I used to have a client who, whenever I picked him up for speech, would pretend he was falling asleep. And in the beginning, I fell for it because I thought that, okay, maybe he had a rough night. And I called his mom and I said, every time I pick up Brian, he's sleeping. And she's like, oh no, that's what he does when he doesn't want to do something. So that's a escape. And actually, believe it or not, that's negative reinforcement because he pretended he was sleeping and then he got out of speech, technically. A tangible, right? That's a secondary reinforcer. And a sensory, that could be primary or secondary. So we talked about materials, we talked about activities, and now we've just wrapped up talking about reinforcers. And I just want you to think on this question. How often should you change activities in a session? I'm not talking about goals. I'm not talking about procedures. How often should you change activities? I want you to think about that. Jot down some notes, and I will see you in class next time. Take care.